The scent of lemon polish still lingers faintly in the air of the nursery, a smell I associate now not with freshness and anticipation, but with a kind of cruel, lingering hope. I had cleaned that room myself, dusted every surface, arranged the tiny clothes in the drawers my husband, long gone now, had built with such clumsy, loving hands for our own children. I polished the antique rocking chair, imagining the weight of a small, perfect body against mine, the soft down of a baby's hair against my cheek. This house, this solid, comfortable home that had held a lifetime of memories, was ready to welcome a new generation, ready to echo with the sounds of infant cries and lullabies sung just slightly off key. I had pictured it so clearly, an almost tangible scene I could reach out and touch, sunlight streaming through the window. I'd hung with blackout curtains patterned with little bears, warming the space where a crib stood, already made up with the softest cotton sheets. There was a mobile above it, handmade, felt moons and stars that would surely capture a baby's wide, wondering eyes. Every detail was a thread woven into the fabric of my future, a future I had waited for with a patience that only motherhood, and then its long, quiet aftermath, can teach you. My own children were grown, their busy lives unfolding further and further from the orbit of their origin, and while I understood that gravitational pull, that inevitable drift, the prospect of a grandchild was like the promise of a new star in my personal universe, a chance to feel that fierce, protective love again, maybe softer this time, less fraught with the constant, low hum of responsibility, more pure joy. My son, Daniel, was the first to give me this hope. His wife, Sarah, was quiet, reserved, a city girl through and through, and I'd always felt a faint distance with her, a sense that she saw my life, my home, as something charmingly rural, perhaps a little behind the times. I tried not to mind. She made Daniel happy, and that was, after all, the most important thing. When they told me the news, Daniel's voice on the phone was thick with emotion, something rare for him. My steady, pragmatic son, Sarah, was beside him, her softer voice adding details about due dates and scans. I cried then, great, heaving sobs of pure happiness and gratitude, the kind that leaves you breathless but lighter. I immediately started making plans. I offered to host the baby shower. Something simple, dear. Just family, a few close friends. But Sarah politely declined, saying her own mother had already offered to throw a larger, more formal affair. I offered to knit a blanket, to help set up their nursery in their sleek, minimalist apartment miles away. My offers were met with polite refusals. Explanations about their modern aesthetic, their preference for store-bought items that were tested and safe. It stung a little, the subtle implication that my homemade efforts, my old-fashioned ways, weren't quite good enough. But I pushed the feeling down. It wasn't about me, I told myself. It was about the baby, about supporting them in whatever way they needed. I sent gift cards, practical things from expensive baby boutiques they favored, tried to show my excitement through cheerful texts and carefully chosen small gifts delivered to their door. The nursery here remained ready, a silent testament to a dream I held close, the hope that they would visit often, that I would be a part of the baby's life in the way my own mother had been part of my children's, a constant, loving presence, a source of help and comfort. I imagined the sound of tiny footsteps overhead, the smell of baby powder in these quiet rooms. It was a simple dream, an old-fashioned one perhaps, but deeply, profoundly felt. And then as the due date crept closer, the polite distance from Sarah began to feel less like a preference and more like a policy. Phone calls became shorter, visits non-existent. Daniel, when I spoke to him, seemed stressed, preoccupied, always rushing off the phone. The excited anticipation I felt began to curdle into a low-level anxiety, a sense of unease, that something wasn't right, that the door I expected to open was slowly, silently closing. The calls started innocent enough. Questions about baby products, advice on sleep schedules, things that made me feel useful, connected. But they quickly morphed into something else. Instructions, lists of demands, masquerading as polite requests. When you come to visit, Mom, please don't wear any perfume. Sarah is very sensitive. Of course, I agreed. We're only using organic, unscented laundry detergent. Just so you know, if you wash anything here, naturally. We've decided no visitors for the first 2 weeks just so we can bond as a new family. Understandable, if a little strict. My own mother had practically moved in to help when my first was born. A whirlwind of casserole dishes and laundry detergent. The times were different. I told myself this generation did things their own way. I respected that, or I tried to. I bought the unscented detergent, packed clothes free of any fragrance. I prepared myself for the 2-week wait, promising myself patience. But then the rules became more specific, more pointed. We're requesting anyone who visits is fully vaccinated against everything, including the flu and whooping cough. Done, done, done. I'd always kept up with my vaccinations, and we'd prefer visitors wear masks when holding the baby. A little unusual, I thought, especially after 2 weeks. But all right. I bought a pack of soft cloth masks. It felt like a test, each request a hoop I had to jump through, and I jumped, trying to show them how much I wanted to be a part of this, how willing I was to adapt, but the hoops kept getting higher, the demands stranger, until they felt less like rules for the baby's health and more like barriers erected specifically to keep me out. The calls where I tried to discuss practical help, meals, errands, an extra pair of hands, were brushed aside. We have it covered, Mom. We're getting a night nurse. Sarah's mother is handling that. It was always Sarah's mother. She lived closer. She was more aligned with their modern parenting philosophy, I suppose. But I was the grandmother too. Didn't that count for something? The distance, once subtle, became a chasm. Weeks turned into months. The due date passed. A text message arrived one morning. Baby Lily Ann was born at 3:47. 7 pubs, 2 Oz. Mom and baby are doing well. That was it. No phone call, no photo, just a stark, impersonal text. Lily Ann. The name was lovely, old-fashioned, a tiny flicker of warmth in the cold, digital announcement. I replied immediately, pouring out my love and congratulations, asking when I could visit. The reply came hours later. We'll let you know. And then silence. Days bled into a week. I called. No answer. I texted. Short, vague replies. Always citing exhaustion, needing to bond, wanting privacy. My anxiety became a knot in my stomach, a constant, churning nausea. Had I done something wrong? Said something out of turn? Was it the time I'd mentioned that my babies slept better on their stomachs, quickly followed by a retraction and apology, knowing recommendations had changed? Was it the fact that my house wasn't as minimalist as Sarah's apartment? The reasons I conjured felt flimsy, insufficient to explain this complete shutdown. Then, a week after the birth, Daniel finally called. His voice was strained, tight. He didn't ask how I was, didn't offer details about Lily Ann. Beyond confirming she was healthy, he launched straight into it. Mom, he said. And the way he said it, not mom like he was talking to his mother, but mom like he was addressing a problem, sent a shiver down my spine. We need to talk about visits. My heart leaped. Finally. Oh, Daniel. Yes. When can I come? I can bring. Mom, listen. He cut me off. Sarah and I have discussed it. We're setting boundaries. Boundaries. The word felt like a physical blow. What kind of boundaries, dear? I asked, my voice trembling. We've decided that until Lily Ann has had all her initial immunizations, which won't be for several months, we don't think it's safe for her to be held by anyone who isn't fully strictly adhering to our protocols. And honestly, Mom, with your health, you know, Sarah and I just don't feel comfortable. My health? What health? I had high blood pressure. Managed perfectly with medication, the occasional creaky joint, the usual things that came with age. Nothing that posed a risk to a baby. My health is fine, Daniel, I said, confused. What are you talking about? There was a pause, a heavy silence on the line. Then he delivered the words that would cleave my life in two. he said. I couldn't hold my own grandchild. He didn't say it like that. Not exactly. Not in those precise words. But the meaning was unmistakable, crushing, brutal. He said, Mom, we've decided it's best if you don't. No. Hold Lily Ann, Tunny for the foreseeable future. The air left my lungs. The room spun. Don't hold my grandchild. The grandchild I had dreamed of, planned for, whose room stood ready in my house. Don't hold the tiny life that was my flesh and blood, my connection to the future. It wasn't just about holding. It was about touch, about connection, about the fundamental bond between grandmother and grandchild. It was a total denial of my role, my love, my very existence as her grandmother. The world went silent, except for the frantic beating of my own heart. He said I couldn't hold my own grandchild. The receiver felt heavy and cold in my hand after Daniel hung up. I stood in the silent house, the polished nursery door visible down the hall, a mocking symbol of my thwarted hopes. Don't hold her. The words echoed in the emptiness, each syllable a hammer blow against my chest. It wasn't a polite request, not a health precaution explained with genuine concern. It was a decree, a punishment. But for what? My mind scrambled, searching for a reason. Something I could have done. Something I could apologize for, fix. Had I been too eager, too interfering? Had Sarah simply used my age, my perfectly managed health issues, as a convenient excuse? Or was it deeper? Was it a resentment I hadn't recognized, a long simmering issue finally coming to a head? The thought that my own son, the child I had carried, birthed, nurtured, would inflict such a wound was unfathomable. I remembered rocking him in that very chair, singing him to sleep, the feel of his small hand curled around my finger. How could that same person deny me the simple, fundamental act of holding his child? The betrayal was a physical ache, a searing pain that settled deep in my bones. Days turned into a blur of disbelief and agony. I ate mechanically, slept fitfully, my dreams haunted by images of a baby I hadn't seen. A baby I wasn't allowed to touch. I wanted to call Daniel, to scream, to plead, to demand an explanation, but the cold finality in his voice stopped me. He wasn't open to discussion. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an order. My quiet strength, usually a steady current beneath the surface, felt depleted, replaced by a crushing helplessness. What could I do? They had all the power. They had the baby. I was on the outside looking in at a life I desperately wanted to be a part of, a life being deliberately kept from me. My friend Martha came by one afternoon. She's a no-nonsense woman, sharp and kind in equal measure. She found me sitting in the rocking chair in the empty nursery, just rocking back and forth, tears streaming down my face. I hadn't even heard her knock. She sat beside me, not asking questions at first, just holding my hand, letting me cry. When I finally managed to choke out the words, "He said I can't hold her," Martha's face hardened. "He what?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. I told her everything. The escalating demands, the impersonal text, Daniel's cold phone call. Martha listened, her grip on my hand tightening. "That is beyond cruel," she said finally. "That's not about health, Mary. That's about control. And it's about hurting you." Her words, blunt and true, sliced through the fog of my grief. Control. Yes, that was it. They weren't just protecting the baby. They were asserting their dominance, their right to dictate who was worthy and who was not. And they had deemed me, the grandmother, unworthy of even the most basic physical connection. Martha stayed for hours that day. She didn't offer platitudes. She offered practical anger. "You can't let them do this," she said. "They can't just come erase you." But what could I do? They were the parents. The law, I assumed, was on their side. Grandparents had no rights, did they? I had always believed that. It was a common understanding, wasn't it? Parental rights were paramount. Martha didn't know the specifics of the law, but she knew it felt wrong, profoundly wrong. to deny a loving grandmother access to her grandchild without just cause. And your health was clearly a flimsy, insulting excuse. As the days turned into weeks, the initial shock gave way to a simmering resentment, a low burn of indignation that started to fuel something else. Resolve. I looked around my house, at the pictures on the mantel, Daniel as a chubby toddler, as a gap-toothed schoolboy, as a solemn teenager at graduation. I had poured my life into raising him, into creating a stable, loving home. Was this the return on that investment? Exclusion? Contempt? The quiet strength that had been beaten down began to stir again, tentatively at first, like a buried seed pushing towards the light. I remembered other times I'd had to be strong, after my husband died, managing the finances I knew nothing about, raising 2 teenagers on my own, navigating grief and responsibility simultaneously. I had done hard things before. This felt like the hardest, because the pain came from within my own family, from the one person who should have protected my heart, not shattered it. The thought of the baby Lillian growing and changing, a stranger to me, was unbearable. I saw photos Sarah posted occasionally on social media, carefully curated snapshots of a perfect life I wasn't allowed to touch. A tiny hand holding a parent's finger, a sleeping face framed by a delicate bonnet. Each image was a fresh twist of the knife. They were parading her existence while denying mine. It was an inversion of everything family was supposed to be. Love was being weaponized, used to punish and control. And something inside me, the core of that quiet, enduring strength, finally snapped. I couldn't let them do this. I couldn't let them take my grandchild away from me without a fight. The idea, initially a faint whisper in the darkness of my despair, began to grow louder, more insistent. There had to be a way. There had to be something I could do. The decision to seek legal counsel wasn't made lightly. It felt enormous, like stepping off a cliff. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was formal, public, a declaration of war. It felt alien, wrong, to consider involving lawyers and courts in something so personal, so deeply rooted in love and its twisted denial. But what choice did I have? Every attempt at reconciliation, every plea for understanding, had been met with silence or reinforced demands. I needed help. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could tell me if my maternal heart's conviction that this was unjust, that a grandparent's love should not be so easily dismissed, had any standing in the eyes of the law. I found a local attorney through a friend of Martha's, a woman named Miss Davies. Her office was quiet, professional, filled with the faint smell of old paper and a hushed sense of gravity. Sitting across from her imposing desk, recounting the story felt surreal. Speaking the words aloud, he said, "I couldn't hold my own grandchild," to a stranger made the absurdity and cruelty of it even more stark. Miss Davies listened patiently, her expression neutral but attentive. I laid it all out. The anticipation, the preparations, the escalating demands, the cold announcement, the total exclusion. I showed her the sparse texts, the lack of communication. I explained my health, my perfectly managed conditions, how ridiculous their concerns truly were. I tried to convey the depth of my love for the grandchild I hadn't even met, the aching emptiness left by her absence. It was difficult, stripping bare such raw emotion for a professional, but I knew I had to make her understand. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Miss Davies leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "Ms. Peterson," she said, her voice calm and measured, "what your son and daughter-in-law are doing is certainly cruel. Legally." My heart sank. Here it was, the confirmation that I had no rights. Grandparent visitation rights are complex and vary greatly depending on the state, she continued, and a tiny spark of hope flickered. It is generally difficult to override the wishes of fit parents. However, there are circumstances where a court can grant visitation if denying it would be detrimental to the child. Detrimental to the child. Was being denied access to a loving grandmother detrimental? It felt that way to me. But would a court see it and Davies added, her gaze direct. Most states have statutes that allow for grandparent visitation, particularly when the parents are denying all access without a compelling reason. General health concerns that are being managed or a preference for their own family's involvement are often not considered compelling reasons in court. She explained the process. Filing a petition for grandparent visitation, demonstrating a pre-existing relationship or a thwarted attempt to establish one, and proving that visitation is in the best interest of the child. It will involve mediation first, most likely, she said. An attempt to reach an agreement outside of court? If that fails, it goes before a judge. Mediation. The thought of sitting across from Daniel and Sarah, with a mediator present, trying to negotiate access to my grandchild, felt both necessary and terrifying. Necessary because it was the only path forward, terrifying because of the confrontation, the dredging up of hurt and accusation. But Miss Davies spoke with quiet confidence. She believed I had a case, that their complete denial of access was unreasonable and could be challenged. Filing the petition was a formality on paper, but it felt monumental in my heart. It was the point of no return. The moment I officially declared that I would fight for my place in my grandchild's life. The papers were served, and the reaction was swift and explosive. Daniel called, not with the strained control of before, but with outright fury. "How could you, Mom?" he yelled into the phone, his voice distorted by anger and betrayal. "Suing us? Your own son? This is unbelievable." Sarah was in the background, her voice sharp and accusing. "We thought you loved us. This is just trying to hurt us." Their outrage felt perverse, an inversion of reality. They were the ones who had inflicted the hurt, who had severed the ties, and now I was the villain for seeking a connection. I tried to explain, calmly at first, that I wasn't trying to hurt them, only to see Lillian, to be her grandmother. But they weren't listening. They saw it as an attack, an overreach, an unforgivable transgression. "You'll regret this, Mom," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a cold, hard tone. I barely recognized. "You think you're going to win? You think you can just force your way in? We will fight this with everything we have." And with that, he hung up. The line went dead, leaving me alone again. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of despair, but the charged quiet before a storm. The fight was officially on. The slow burn tension I had lived with for months had ignited, and there was no turning back. I had taken the first step onto a path I never imagined walking, a path that led not to a grandchild's rocking chair, but to a courtroom. Preparing for court felt like sifting through the wreckage of my family life. Every text message I'd saved, every email, every carefully worded card I'd sent that had gone unanswered or unacknowledged. Each piece of evidence was a shard of glass from a broken window pane, reflecting the pain of exclusion. Miss Davies needed everything. A complete timeline of the relationship, the offers of help, the gradual withdrawal, the specific demands, and finally the devastating pronouncement that led me here. We went over my health records, obtaining letters from my doctors confirming my conditions were well managed and posed no risk. We discussed potential witnesses. Martha, who had seen my distress and heard my story firsthand. Perhaps a neighbor who had witnessed my interactions with Daniel over the years. Someone who could speak to my character, my stability, my love for my children. It felt strange, needing strangers and acquaintances to vouch for my fitness as a grandmother, a role that should have been as natural as breathing. The emotional toll was immense. Digging up the past meant reliving the hurt, the confusion, the crushing sense of rejection. Sitting in Miss Davies' office, recounting Daniel's cold words, the forced composure I tried to maintain would sometimes crack, my voice thick with unshed tears. Miss Davies was understanding, guiding me gently through the process, focusing on facts and legal strategy, but acknowledging the underlying pain. She warned me that Daniel and Sarah's legal team would likely try to portray me negatively, perhaps as unstable, interfering, or demanding. They might twist my actions, turn my love into obsession, my offers of help into attempts to control. the thought of my own son and his wife, people I had loved and welcomed into my life, actively working to undermine my character in front of a judge, was almost unbearable. It was a different kind of betrayal, a public one, designed to strip away my credibility, to make me seem unworthy of the very connection I was fighting for. But with each piece of evidence we gathered, each strategy session with Miss Davies, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about me anymore, not just about my hurt. It was about Liliane. It was about the principle that love and family connection should not be wielded as weapons, that a child should not be denied access to a loving grandparent because of adult conflict. My quiet strength, tested and refined by years of navigating life's challenges, became a steel core. I wouldn't be intimidated. I wouldn't be broken. I would stand in that courtroom and speak my truth, not just for myself, but for every grandparent who had been unjustly cut off, for the unseen bonds of family that were being carelessly, cruelly severed. The pacing of the legal process was slow, agonizingly so. Mediation was scheduled months after the petition was filed. The anticipation built, a heavy weight in my chest. I practiced staying calm, articulate, focusing on my love for Liliane and my desire for a healthy, positive relationship. Despite the pain Daniel and Sarah had inflicted, I polished the nursery again, the rocking chair gleaming in the sunlight, a silent promise of a future I was fighting to claim. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of a grandmother's enduring hope against calculated cruelty. Mediation arrived, a sterile room with a large table, feeling utterly out of place for the raw, bleeding heart of a family dispute. Daniel and Sarah sat across from me, their faces set, wary. Sarah avoided my eyes entirely. Daniel looked angry, defensive. Their lawyer sat beside them, sleek and professional, radiating an air of quiet disapproval. Miss Davies was beside me, a reassuring presence. The mediator, a kindly-faced woman, explained the process, emphasizing finding common ground, focusing on the best interests of the child. Best interests. That phrase hung in the air, a stark contrast to the actions that had led us here. Their lawyer spoke first, laying out their position. They reiterated their health concerns in vague terms, then pivoted to paint me as an interfering high-demand parent who couldn't respect boundaries. It was a carefully constructed narrative, designed to minimize their cruelty and maximize my perceived flaws. I listened, a cold knot forming in my stomach, hearing my love and concern twisted into something negative. It was the public airing of their private disdain, confirming all my fears about how they saw me. When it was my turn, Miss Davies guided me. I spoke not of blame or anger, but of love. I described my anticipation of Liliane's arrival, the joy it brought, the preparations I had made. I talked about my love for Daniel, how I had raised him, the close bond we once shared. I spoke of the pain of exclusion, the specific moments of cruelty, the text announcement, the phone call, the devastating words that I couldn't hold her. I explained my health status, providing the doctor's notes, dismantling their flimsy excuse. I emphasized my only goal, to have a loving, consistent relationship with my grandchild, to be a positive presence in her life. I looked at Daniel and Sarah as I spoke, trying to reach something in them, a flicker of the son I knew, the woman he had chosen who I had once hoped to welcome fully into our family. There was nothing, just blank stares, averted gazes and tight lips. The mediator tried to find a compromise.
Suggested limited supervised visits. Suggested scheduled video calls. I was willing to be flexible to meet them halfway. More than halfway, just for access to Liliane.
But they were unwilling to budge. Their position was absolute denial of unsupervised visitation. Limited, highly restricted, and infrequent supervised visits only if I met a list of unreasonable conditions. Conditions that felt designed to be impossible to meet, confirming my fear that this wasn't about safety, but about control and punishment. The mediation failed, predictably, perhaps. They held firm to their narrative, their position of absolute power, unwilling to concede even an inch. They left the room quickly, silently, leaving me with Davies and the mediator, the failure heavy in the air. Well, the mediator said gently, it seems we are at an impasse. The next step will be court. Court. The word no longer felt terrifying. It felt like the only remaining option, the necessary battlefield when all other avenues for peace had been exhausted. The slow burn tension of waiting for mediation was replaced by the sharper, more focused tension of preparing for trial. We refined my testimony, gathering more details, anticipating their arguments. We decided Martha would testify, a voice of external reason and support. The symbolic objects in my home, the polished rocking chair, the untouched nursery, the family photos, weren't just personal reminders anymore. They were part of the story I would tell, tangible symbols of a love denied and a life excluded. The courtroom felt less like a place of abstract law and more like a stage where the raw drama of family love and betrayal would be laid bare. I was ready to step onto that stage, not as a victim, but as a woman fighting for her rightful place, for a bond that should be sacred, a bond my own son had tried to sever. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, less imposing, yet filled with a palpable sense of formality and consequence. The air was cool, dry, smelling faintly of disinfectant and old paper. I sat beside Miss Davies, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to project a calmness I didn't entirely feel. Across the room sat Daniel and Sarah, flanked by their lawyer. Daniel looked different in a suit, stiff, unfamiliar. Sarah was pale, her face drawn. They still wouldn't meet my eyes. The judge entered, a woman with a stern but not unkind face, and we all rose. The proceedings began, a series of legal formalities, opening statements. Their lawyer presented their case, focusing on parental rights, the challenges they faced as new parents, and reiterating the vague safety concerns they had about me. Dressed up in professional language that made them sound almost reasonable, they described me as overbearing, unwilling to respect their boundaries, implying that granting visitation would be disruptive and stressful for them, and by extension for the baby. It was a careful performance, designed to cast me as the aggressor, the unreasonable party forcing her way into their perfect private life. Then it was our turn. Ms. Davies began by outlining the legal basis for grandparent visitation in our state, emphasizing the statute that allows it when parents are unreasonably denying access. She spoke of the importance of grandparents in a child's life, the unique bond they offer. And then she turned to my story. I was the first witness. Walking to the stand felt like an out-of-body experience, my legs moving automatically while my mind focused on the task ahead. I took the oath, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Miss Davies began with gentle questions, establishing who I was, my relationship with Daniel, the joy I felt when I learned Sarah was pregnant. I spoke about the nursery I had prepared, the gifts I had sent, the offers of help that were declined. I described the shift in their behavior, the growing distance, the sense of being deliberately shut out, and then we got to the phone call. Miss Davies asked me to recount what Daniel said. I looked at Daniel across the room, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Taking a deep breath, I spoke the words that had been a constant ache in my heart for months. He said they had decided it was best if I didn't hold Lillian for the foreseeable future. I let the words hang in the air, plain, unadorned, allowing their simple cruelty to resonate. I explained how he had cited my health, a claim I refuted, providing the medical evidence. I explained how his words had felt not like concern, but like a denial of my love, my role, my fundamental connection to this child. I spoke of the pain, the confusion, the sleepless nights, the agony of knowing my grandchild was just miles away, a stranger to me. I talked about the photos on social media, seeing glimpses of her life, reinforcing my exclusion. Every picture, I said, my voice gaining strength, was a reminder of what was being kept from me, of the bond I was being denied. It was like looking through a window at a party I wasn't invited to, a party where my own grandchild was the guest of honor. Their lawyer cross-examined me, trying to trip me up to make me seem emotional, unstable, unreasonable. "Isn't it true, Miss Peterson," he pressed, his voice smooth and condescending, "that you were overly eager, that you bombarded them with unsolicited advice and offers?" I met his gaze steadily. I was excited. I was offering the help and support my own mother offered me. It was never meant to be demanding, only loving, and you didn't respect their boundaries regarding health and safety. He challenged. I respected their boundaries, I countered. I got the vaccinations they requested. I offered to wear masks. But when the denial became absolute, based on false premises, I realized it wasn't about safety. It was about something else. "And so you decided to sue your own son?" he finished, putting a heavy emphasis on the word sue, trying to make it sound monstrous. "I decided to fight for my grandchild," I replied, my voice clear and strong. "When I was denied the most basic right, the right to hold her, without valid reason, I realized that waiting and hoping would not work. I took this step because I believe a child benefits from the love of her grandmother. I took this step because I refuse to let fear and control dictate the terms of my family relationships. I took this step because I love Lillian, and I want to be a part of her life." Looking at Daniel then, I added, quieter, but loud enough for the room to hear, "It broke my heart to bring this here, but they left me no choice." Martha testified after me, calmly and effectively describing my distress, my character, the undeniable pain she had witnessed. She corroborated my attempts to be supportive and understanding before the complete cutoff. Hearing her speak about me, about the person I was outside of this conflict, felt validating, a reminder that the cruel narrative presented by Daniel and Sarah's lawyer wasn't the whole story. The focus of the day shifted from abstract legal arguments to the raw human reality of a family fracture, of love denied, of a grandmother fighting for a place in her grandchild's life. I looked at the judge, trying to gauge her reaction, but her face remained impassive. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional cough or the rustle of papers. This sterile, formal space had become the vessel for my deepest emotions, my greatest pain, and my fierce, unyielding hope. It felt surreal, exposing the most intimate parts of my life in this public forum, but also, strangely, empowering. I had been silenced for so long, made to feel invisible and unworthy. Now I had a voice, and I was using it to claim my truth, to demand recognition for a bond that deserved to be cherished, not casually discarded. The quiet strength I had relied on throughout my life was no longer quiet. It was speaking clear and resolute in a courtroom, fighting for the simple, profound right to hold my own grandchild. The wait for the judge's decision was excruciating. Days stretched into weeks, each morning bringing a fresh wave of anxiety. I tried to distract myself, working in the garden, baking bread, activities that usually soothed me, but the tension remained, a tight coil in my chest. I replayed the court hearing in my mind, dissecting every word spoken, every expression on the judge's face. Had I been clear enough? Had I conveyed the depth of my pain, the sincerity of my love for Lillian? Had their carefully constructed narrative of me as an interfering, difficult parent been convincing? Miss Davies was cautiously optimistic, reminding me that the judge had seemed particularly engaged during my testimony, and Martha's, and that their grounds for denying access had appeared flimsy when scrutinized. But the law was complex, and parental rights were given significant weight. It felt like my entire future, my connection to the next generation, hung precariously in the balance, dependent on the decision of one person who knew nothing of me or my family until a few hours in a courtroom. Then the call came. Miss Davies' voice was calm, professional. "Mary, I have the judge's order." My heart stopped. I held my breath, bracing myself for either outcome. "The judge has ruled in your favor," she said. The words were simple, but they felt like an explosion of light. Ruled in my favor. She found that your son and daughter-in-law's reasons for denying you access were insufficient and unreasonable, particularly given your efforts to address their stated concerns, your documented health status. She specifically noted that denying a loving grandparent a relationship without compelling cause is not in the child's best interest. I sank into a chair, tears streaming down my face, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a deep, profound sadness. Relief that I had won, that the fight hadn't been in vain, that the door to Lilianne's life wasn't permanently closed. Exhaustion from the sheer emotional and mental toll of the battle. And sadness because this victory had come at such a cost, requiring a legal battle against my own son, a battle that had likely inflicted irreparable damage on our relationship. The judge's order granted me structured visitation. Initially, it would be supervised, mediated visits, gradually increasing in frequency and duration, with the potential for unsupervised visits after a period of successful integration, provided I continued to adhere to reasonable health precautions, which I had always been willing to do. It wasn't unfettered access, not the easy, natural flow of a typical grandparent relationship I had once envisioned, but it was access. It was a foot in the door, a legal right to be present in Lilianne's life. It was a formal acknowledgement that my love and desire for a relationship were valid, that I deserved a place. The first mediated visit was scheduled for a few weeks later. The location was neutral, a family support center. Daniel and Sarah were there, accompanied by the mediator. Their faces were a mask of resentment and forced politeness. They still wouldn't look at me directly. And then the door opened, and she was there. Lilianne. She was smaller than I imagined. A perfect, delicate bundle held by Sarah. Her eyes were wide, curious, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. She looked a little like Daniel had as a baby. The same curve to her cheek, the same dark hair. My breath caught in my throat. This was her, my grandchild. The person I had fought so hard, endured so much, just to meet. Sarah handed her to the mediator, who then gently placed her in my arms. It was a moment I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind, in the quiet of the empty nursery, in the solitude of my pain. But the reality was different. She felt feather-light, fragile. Her small hand, so incredibly tiny, instinctively curled around my finger. She stared up at me with an expression of pure, open curiosity. No judgment, no history, just the innocent presence of a new life. And in that moment, holding her, feeling the impossible softness of her skin against my hand, the weary weight of the past months seemed to lift. Just a fraction. The courtroom battles, the legal documents, the bitter words, they faded into the background, replaced by the overwhelming simple reality of this child in my arms. The connection I had fought for, the physical bond I had been denied, was finally real. I didn't know what the future held. I knew the relationship with Daniel and Sarah might never heal, that the bitterness and resentment might linger. This first meeting wasn't a magical erasure of the pain that had brought us here. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension, with the weight of the legal judgment that had forced this interaction. But holding Lilianne, feeling her warmth, seeing the quiet wonder in her eyes, was a redemption of sorts. It was the fulfillment of that deep, fundamental need to connect, to love, to be a grandmother in the most primal sense. I held her close, breathing in the faint, sweet smell of her hair, a scent that was entirely new and yet instantly familiar, the scent of new life, of hope, of a future I had fought to claim. The mediated visits continued, slowly morphing into supervised visits at a designated location, then eventually supervised visits at my home, in the nursery I had prepared with such hopeful love. Each visit was still tinged with a fragile awkwardness, the air thick with unspoken history when Daniel or Sarah were present, which was a requirement for the supervised time. They remained distant, polite, but cool, their resentment a low hum beneath the surface of our interactions. They watched me constantly, evaluating, ready it seemed to find fault, to seize on any perceived mistake that might allow them to petition the court to restrict access again. It was exhausting, this constant performance of competent, loving grandmother under their critical gaze. But the focus was never truly on them. It was on Lillian. She was growing, changing, her personality beginning to bloom. At first, she was wary of me, a stranger in a strange environment. My heart ached during those early visits, knowing she didn't know who I was, that months of precious time had been stolen from us. But as the visits became more regular, as she became accustomed to my face, my voice, the rhythm of my heartbeat, as I held her in the rocking chair, a tentative bond began to form. She would reach for me, smile at me, her laughter filling the nursery, chasing away the shadows of the past. Those moments were pure gold, a precious reward for the difficult fight I had waged. Playing with her on the floor, reading her stories, singing her lullabies. These simple acts, denied to me for so long, were now the cornerstone of my week, the source of immense joy. I learned her quirks, her preferences, the way she scrunched her nose when she was concentrating, the sound she made when she was particularly delighted. These were the small intimacies of grandparenting I had yearned for, the details that weave the fabric of a loving relationship. The house itself seemed to breathe a little easier with her presence. The silent rooms no longer felt empty and mocking. They felt warm, lived in, filled with the promise of future visits. The rocking chair, once a symbol of thwarted hope, was now fulfilling its purpose, creaking softly as I rocked my grandchild to sleep, the same chair where I had rocked her father decades ago. This inversion of power dynamic was subtle, but profound. They had sought to control and exclude, using their parental status as a shield. I had used the law, yes, but more importantly, I had used my unwavering determination and the undeniable pull of love to reclaim my place. The court order didn't force them to love me or to forgive, but it forced them to allow the possibility of a relationship between me and Lillian. And in that allowance, I found my empowerment. It wasn't the loud, aggressive empowerment often portrayed. It was a quiet, deeply internal strength, the knowledge that I had stood up for myself and for my grandchild, that I had refused to be erased, that I had fought for love and won a space for it to grow, even in the most challenging circumstances. The relationship with Daniel and Sarah remained strained, a constant source of underlying tension. There were no warm family dinners, no casual drop-ins. Communication was minimal, often through lawyers or mediated platforms. It was a constant, painful reminder of the rift that had opened between us, a wound that seemed unwilling to heal. Sometimes the sadness of that lost connection with my son would overwhelm me. How had we gotten here? How could the bond between mother and child be so fragile, so easily broken by resentment and control? The bittersweet nature of my situation was always present, the joy of Lillian juxtaposed with the sorrow of my fractured family. But as Lillian grew older, becoming more independent, more communicative, she began to express her own feelings about our visits. She looked forward to coming to my house, to spending time with me. She called me Grandma with clear affection. Her love, innocent and uncomplicated by the adult drama that surrounded her, was the truest measure of my success, the most powerful validation of my fight. I realized, reflecting on the long, arduous journey, that this wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about refusing to let someone else define my worth or dictate my relationships. It was about finding my voice when they had tried to silence me. It was about transforming betrayal into resilience, resignation into action. The house, once a silent witness to my pain, was now filled with the sounds of Lillian's laughter, a living testament to the power of persistence and love. I had been undervalued, dismissed, betrayed, but I had found the strength within me to fight back, to demand my place. And standing in that nursery now, watching Lillian play with the felt moons on the mobile, the sunlight warming the room just as I had imagined, I knew I was no longer the woman who had sat despairing in a rocking chair. I was a grandmother, present and accounted for, holding my own grandchild in a home that had waited patiently, and the quiet strength within me felt not just restored, but truly, profoundly empowered. The scars of the battle remained, a permanent reminder of the cost, but they were also a testament to the depth of a grandmother's love and the unwavering resolve to protect that love, no matter the fight.